This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Ecuador is in the spotlight right now as it faces big security challenges and a tight election coming up in February. Today, an overview of what to expect in politics, the economy, and Ecuador's relationship with the new administration in Washington.
Most observers are pretty excited about the opportunities for Ecuador with the new Trump government and re-elected President Noboa. After all, they're both right-wing elites, and Noboa has even some personal ties to people in Trump's circle. I think there's plenty of areas of mutual interest between the Trump administration and the Noboa administration, most notably drug trafficking and immigration.
You probably remember the terrifying images out of Ecuador almost exactly a year ago. Shortly after President Daniel Noboa took office, drug gangs took over a television station, kidnapped police, and the streets of the business capital Guayaquil were left deserted. It was the worst spasm of violence to date in a country that in recent years has become the most violent in all of South America. It was a moment when the rest of the Americas, including the United States, was really paying attention to Ecuador, conscious of the threat of organized crime groups that are expanding across so much of the region right now. Since then, President Noboa has seen some progress in improving security. Homicides fell about 16% in 2024, but it's still ranked as the second most violent year in Ecuador's history. Noboa also had to deal with a severe energy crisis that led to planned blackouts of up to 14 hours a day that took a significant toll on Noboa's popularity. Meanwhile, the economy may have also experienced a recession last year. And that's the situation as we approach elections scheduled for February 9th. The two leading candidates in that election will be the incumbent, President Noboa, on the center-right, and the left-wing candidate Luisa González, who represents the party of former President Rafael Correa. Today on the podcast, we'll take a broad look at the challenges that Ecuador is facing, including the state of the fight against organized crime, the mood of the country as this election approaches, trying to get some insight into President Noboa himself. To paint this far-reaching picture for us, we've invited our friend Sebastián Hurtado. Sebastián runs the political risk consultancy firm Prófitas, based in Quito. Sebastián, welcome back to the AQ Podcast.
Always great to be here, Brian.
Sebastián, as I noted in the introduction, this is a country that has been through so much over the last year plus. What is the national mood as we approach this election?
The first thing that I will note is that this is a very unique election, Brian, for several reasons. The first one is that this is the first election after what has actually been an interim government of President Noboa. At the same time, the election takes place in the middle of an unprecedented security crisis in Ecuador. On the other hand, Ecuador is living through a major, I would say a dire economic situation. Ecuador is the only Andean country that has contracted on a per capita basis for over 5 years now. And we are facing a lost decade. And it is an election also taking place in the middle of a major disarray of state institutions, with most state institutions having no legitimacy at all.
So they say, Sebastián, that most elections are either change elections or continuity elections. It sounds to me like you're describing a change election. Am I wrong?
Not necessarily, and that's a key factor of it. As I said, if we were facing the same scenario after a 4-year government, it will definitely be a change election. But even though there's a strong frustration on how things stand in Ecuador, President Noboa has only been in power for over a year. And even under these circumstances, he still enjoys significant support. We both signaling that he has over 40% of support. Some other polls signaling that he has over 50% support. So that makes this election different from anything we've seen before. President Correa was reelected for twice. No other president in Ecuadorian recent history has faced the prospect of being reelected. So I think most people are still giving President Noboa the benefit of the doubt, even though the situation, I will say, it's pretty dire here at multiple levels that we can elaborate.
What is it about President Noboa that has given at least some Ecuadorians the hope that if he's elected again, he can turn things around? I mean, there's been a lot of attention internationally on his youth. The homicide rate remains very, very high. It is, as you noted, the highest murder rate in all of Latin America, according to some measures. But that rate is down, according to official statistics, 16% over the last year. What is it about him then that is inspiring, at least among some voters, confidence and hope that he might be able to turn things around if elected again?
I think there are two sides to that. One is the fact that I think he still remains like the new thing. And he remains the new guy in Ecuadorian politics. And he remains sort of the outsider of this election. And he remains someone who's different from the political class that has ruled the Ecuador during this century. And actually, he's actively using that narrative in his favor. The other thing is that even though his popularity suffered when Ecuador went through these major energy blackouts last year, at this point, those blackouts are mainly in the past, not necessarily because anything that the government has done, but mostly because it started raining again, and Ecuador is highly dependent on hydroelectric generation. Well, some people credit him for an improved situation. At the same time, I think I agree with you. I think the improvement in the insecurity has been very modest. With the decline that you mentioned, I think it's very modest because we're starting on what was effectively a record year of violence in Ecuador. And after we've gone through a whole year of this war on criminal organizations that President Noboa launched almost a year ago. So the improvements are modest, but still, I think most people see those as improvements anyway.
A year ago, Sebastián, when we were all shocked by these images in Ecuador, I mean, these were images that made their way not just around Latin America, but around the world. And there was an outpouring of support from a lot of countries, including from leaders who probably don't have much ideological sympathy for Noboa's conservative views, but who understood the need to prevent another Latin American country from falling into the clutches of organized crime. There was this realization that Ecuador really mattered in a regional context beyond its size. And so here we are a year later. There's been some progress. You said it's been perhaps slightly underwhelming. Where has President Noboa found the most difficulty in implementing the kinds of security gains that he would like to see? Because he has deployed the military. He's had some cooperation from the political class as a whole, but yet progress has been really difficult. Why is that?
I think the problem facing not only President Noboa, but any government that takes charge of Ecuador in the future is the fact that I think Ecuador lacks the resources, the institutions to deal with the threat that Ecuador is dealing with now in terms of having to fight this massive, powerful, and wealthy international criminal organizations that are responsible for the massive increase in cocaine trade going through Ecuador to the rest of the world.
President Noboa has explicitly distanced himself from the policies of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, saying that Ecuador's constitution needs to be respected. At the same time, some international organizations, as well as local ones in Ecuador, have documented human rights abuses over the last year plus. Human Rights Watch, for example, has highlighted arbitrary arrests, cases of ill treatment in prison, which may in some cases amount to torture. They also say a large number of people who reported as arrested never appear to have been taken before a prosecutor or judge. My question for you, Sebastián, is, has President Noboa faced any political criticism because of this? Is it affecting his odds of re-election at all, or are most Ecuadorians so eager to see the gangs combated that they don't care so much about the tactics?
I think most Ecuadorians are willing to endure or to tolerate abuses in the fight against crime. And that's basically because Ecuadorians are really frustrated with the situation and very concerned about the situation, and are willing to give way to a government that can handle that situation in any way possible. President Noboa and the security forces haven't faced any significant backlash from the cases you've mentioned until the end of last year, when there was this episode of a group of youngsters getting killed in the hands of security forces, or at least that is suspected. And I think that somehow hurt the government and the security forces and started to raise some concerns about the effectiveness of the security policy of President Noboa and the other side effects that that policy could have. But still, I think the larger Ecuadorian population is still willing to tolerate some abuses if that gets the security situation under control.
Sebastián, let's switch gears and talk a bit about the economy, which, as you noted, has really struggled in Ecuador in recent years, even by the standards of Latin America, which has averaged a little under 1% growth over the last decade. The numbers in Ecuador are difficult. General consensus is that the economy only grew about 0.3% in 2024. Perhaps it will do slightly better in 2025. What is wrong with Ecuador's economy?
Many local and international institutions expected for Ecuador to show zero growth during 2024, but actually will end up having a contraction in 2024 that could even reach minus 1%. So that's the reality of this year. And we expect some bounce back in 2025, but it won't be that significant either. Projections talk about a 2% growth in 2025. What is the key driver of that? One is the energy crisis, for sure. That's the most immediate one. But, lack of growth in recent years, I think, has mostly to do with all the instability that Ecuador has lived through in the past 7 years. We haven't had a full, complete government in 7 years if you take into consideration that there was this breakup between the Lenin administration and the correístas, which basically started a new government in the second part of of the Lenin administration. And then we had the Lasso administration that faced significant obstacles to advance his agenda and ended up calling for a muerte cruzada. So he didn't complete his period. And now we have this interim government of President Noboa, and we are having new elections this month. So all that political uncertainty and all the changes in policies that we've seen in the last few years, I think have hurt growth prospects in Ecuador, especially in terms of attracting new private investment, local and international investment, at a time where, the state hasn't had enough resources to invest in growth initiatives in the past few years.
How has that translated into everyday life for Ecuadorians? Is the social situation difficult compared to recent years, or do people feel like their lives are getting worse or staying just about the same?
Well, most Ecuadorians have felt the crisis in terms of losing formal jobs, which have been declining in the last few years, pushing many people into informal employment, and also pushing thousands of Ecuadorians to migrate. However, in recent years, security and energy have become so concerning for Ecuadorians that actually the economic problems of every day have become less relevant for most Ecuadorians. And that's reflected in many polls, that place security, energy, or have been placing security, energy as a key priority for Ecuadorians rather than economic issues.
We'll be back right after this short break. The Peruvian-American writer Maria Rana wrote a fantastic book about the history of people of Latin American descent in the United States. The book is called Latino Land. We'll be hosting Marie here at the Americas Society in New York City on February 26th to talk about the Latin American diaspora, past and present. The event will be free of charge and followed by a reception. You can register on our website, that's americasquarterly.org. We hope to see you there. Let's talk about the opposition. The main leading candidate is Luisa González. She was the one who lost in the runoff to Noboa in 2023. Now she's running again. She's 47 years old, which I think is very young. That's my age. And she, as you mentioned earlier, she's from the party of former President Rafael Correa. How do we understand her? How would she govern if she wins? How, if at all, does she seem different from President Correa, who, of course, governed Ecuador back in the 2000s?
Well, Luisa González is a correísta loyalist, and I think she was picked mainly because of that. She and correísmo in general are interested on bringing back the correísta political order in Ecuador. I think a key card she's playing is to showcase the better times that Ecuador supposedly had during correísmo, and basically blaming all the problems Ecuador is facing now to all the destruction of the institutions that were built during the correísmo.
I have a question for you, Sebastián. The good times that you're referring to were, of course, during sort of the tail end of the commodities boom that we saw throughout Latin America. For a listener who was broadly familiar with Rafael Correa the first time, how would you explain the differences between his movement and, say, Chavismo in Venezuela, and how has it evolved over the years? Because I have to admit, correísmo always struck me as somewhat different in important ways, but guided perhaps by some of the same leftist economic philosophies.
I think there are significant differences between correísmo and Chavismo. To start, I think correístas are far more sophisticated than Chavistas. for sure. And there was a clear difference between President Correa and President Chavez in terms of their understanding of how the world works and their understanding of government and public policy, for sure. So that's one difference. The second difference is that, I think correístas were far more pragmatic than Chavistas in economic policy. And you got to see that towards the second part of correísmo, even though correísmo was very radical at the beginning of their administration, the second part of correísmo, they became more pragmatic. They came back to international financial markets by issuing foreign debt. They signed a free trade agreement with the European Union. They promoted investment in large-scale mining, attracting foreign investments. So I think those are key differences between correísmo and chavismo, for sure. And that's why the outcomes were very different, too.
That all said, is the business community in Ecuador and the foreign investors who you speak with, are they scared of Luisa González?
Most local elites are scared of correísmo coming back, mostly because they don't like left-wing policies in general, but also because they felt that they didn't have the influence that they have traditionally had over government policy in the past. And that was a feature of correísmo. Correísmo really focused on just marginalizing Ecuadorian business and economic elites from public policy. Also, international investors remember this politically motivated default that President Correa promoted at the beginning of their administration. So, any chances of Correistas coming back to power are usually a bad sign for international markets, and you get to see Ecuadorian bonds dropping. And for sure, that's going to happen if Luisa González gets an edge in the election.
There are more than a dozen candidates in this race. They had a debate the other night. Is there anyone else in this field worth watching besides the two that we've spoken about, Noboa and González?
All other candidates poll really low. You have Leonidas Issa, the indigenous leader, polling close to 3%. But the rest of the candidates, they poll around 1%, and within the margin of error. So it is a very two-horse race between correísmo and Noboa.
Sebastián, as you may be aware, we have a new president here in the United States, Donald Trump. If President Noboa is reelected, what do we expect from the relationship with the United States? And I ask this because on the one hand, they would seem on paper to be ideologically aligned, but we also know that Ecuador has been a major sender of people to the United States in recent years, often through irregular migration. Could that and other factors be a source of potential conflict? What do you expect?
Well, most observers are pretty excited about the opportunities for Ecuador with a new Trump government and re-elected President Noboa. After all, they're both right-wing elites, and Noboa has even some personal ties to people in Trump's circle. I think there's plenty of areas of mutual interest between the Trump administration and the Noboa administration. Most notably drug trafficking and immigration, as you mentioned. Ecuador has become a major hub for cocaine exports in recent years and is sending increasing numbers of illegal immigrants to the U.S. And at the same time, the U.S. and Trump has a keen interest in fending off Chinese influence in the region. At the private sector level, the top interest is a free trade agreement with the U.S. Ecuador is the only country in the western coast of the Americas that doesn't have a free trade agreement with the United States. So everybody is optimistic on the possibility of on advancing on those fronts and the help that the U.S. government might provide Ecuador in its fight against criminal organizations in Ecuador. However, I'm a little bit more skeptical on how much we can advance, especially in trade, because I feel that the relationship between Ecuador and the U.S. is very one-sided in the sense that on one side, most of Ecuadorian exports enter the United States duty-free right now. But, Ecuador remains a very closed economy for a number of reasons, not just tariffs, but other taxes, local taxes, capital export taxes. Ecuador remains a very closed economy for American exports. It is interesting to know, for example, that in the last few years, car exports from the United States have declined in terms of market share from 25% a few years ago to 2% in the last year. And basically, it is Chinese and European cars who have taken over that space. On top of that, the United States have significantly supported Ecuador through multilateral organizations and through the IMF support. Ecuador is not far behind from Ukraine in terms of the share of IMF support it has received. So I'm not really sure how President Trump will look at these realities. He being someone who's very transactional and wants to see his American first policies being implemented. However, I think with President Noboa, Ecuador has a much better chance of getting along with the new Trump administration than what Luisa González or a correísta government could have.
Sebastián, final question for you. As we look at Ecuador, like some other countries in the region, I mean, there are echoes here of the recent Peruvian experience where you've seen so much instability politically over an extended period of time that has taken a toll on democracy, has taken a toll on the economy. At the same time, these crises, they don't always go on forever. Ecuador is a country that not so long ago enjoyed a certain amount of stability and was a relative oasis of peace among its neighbors. How hopeful are you that the country can be put back on the right track again? And what do you think it would take to get there?
Well, it will take a few things. A key one is that we desperately need a 4-year government, which we haven't had for a number of years. I think if Ecuador wants to reignite growth, it requires significant economic reforms going forward. Without significant reforms, Ecuador will remain a low growth country, which in itself will put new governments at risk of not remaining in power or not being able to complete their periods. At the same time, on the bright side, I think either President Noboa or Luisa González, due to this two-horse race that I mentioned before, they're likely to be elected with significant blocks in Congress. So either one of them will be able to build a working majority in Congress to advance reforms. And I think that's a good thing. What worries me, I have clarity on what to expect from the correístas and what the political project of correísmo is. I don't have clarity, and I think many Ecuadorians and the business community and investors lack clarity on what Daniel Noboa's political project is. I don't think he has clearly defined it. I think he has been improvising policies during his administration. And I think he still needs to signal where is he headed.
Where, sorry to interrupt you, but where is the uncertainty exactly? I mean, he strikes me as sort of your classic center right conservative who's trying to improve the security situation. Where is the uncertainty that you reference exactly?
Daniel Noboa has not clearly defined his direction or how is he going to implement the changes that he wants to implement. Even though you mentioned that he's a center-right or a right-wing politician, he has been saying that he's a center-left politician. He's pro-business, but he has advanced some very populist measures in recent months. So as I said, I think Noboa has not yet been able to build a clear political narrative behind his political project beyond basically what he defines as a war against criminal organizations and political organizations that are behind those criminal organizations. Beyond that, I don't think there's clarity on what his plans are.
Sebastián, you have helped us, despite all the uncertainty, bring some clarity to this situation. We'll be watching this election very closely. Thanks so much for joining us again on the AQ Podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Happy to be here again.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.